You know those moments when you're just minding your own business at a wedding, and then something happens that completely changes how you see everything. That's exactly what happened to everyone in that garden on a perfect June afternoon. Sandra Bullock stood at the edge of the reception, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, watching her best friend Emily dance with her new husband. The string lights overhead swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting golden patterns across the faces of people lost in celebration. Sandra smiled, but anyone who really knew her could see the heaviness behind it. She'd been America's sweetheart for decades, beloved by millions, yet standing there surrounded by love and laughter. She felt profoundly alone in a way that success and fame could never quite fill. She'd flown in from Atlanta where she was filming, exhausted from 18-hour days, but she wouldn't have missed this for anything. Emily had been there through everything. The divorces that tabloids feasted on, the adoption journeys that tested every ounce of her strength. The nights when being Sandra Bullock felt like wearing armor that was slowly crushing her from the inside out. And Emily never asked for anything except her presence, her real self, the woman behind all the noise. Keanu Reeves arrived late, slipping through the garden gate with that characteristic quietness he carried everywhere, like someone who'd learned long ago that the world was loud enough without him adding to it. He spotted Sandra immediately, the way old friends do in crowded rooms, drawn by something deeper than sight. They'd starred in 2 films together, but their connection went beyond scripts and cameras. It was built on shared understanding, on knowing what it meant to carry grief that the public couldn't see, to smile through losses that would break most people, to keep showing up with kindness when the world gave you every reason to become hard. He walked over and stood beside her without saying anything at first, just existing in the same space, and Sandra felt her shoulders drop an inch, releasing tension she didn't know she was holding. They watched the dancers together, 2 people who'd survived Hollywood's machinery with their humanity somehow intact, though not without scars. "You look tired," Keanu said softly, not as criticism but as recognition, the way you might acknowledge a fellow traveler on a long road. Sandra laughed, a real one this time. "I look like I feel," she said, "which is about 100 years old and running on fumes and coffee." He turned to face her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It wasn't romantic, not in the simple way people might expect. It was bigger than that. It was the look of someone who'd made a decision that frightened and exhilarated him in equal measure. "I need to ask you something," Keanu said, his voice carrying a weight that made the celebration around them seem to fade into background noise. "And I need you to really hear me, not as an actress or a celebrity or any of the things the world needs you to be, just as Sandra, just as my friend." Her heart started beating faster, though she couldn't have said why. The champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand, catching the light. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Sandra's mind went completely blank, her thoughts scattering like birds startled into flight. Because this couldn't be what it looked like. They'd never been that kind of friends, and yet his face held such earnest vulnerability that she couldn't look away, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand frozen as he opened it to reveal not a diamond ring but a simple silver key. "Sandra," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly, showing the emotion he usually kept so carefully controlled. "I'm asking you to let me give you something I should have offered years ago, something that has nothing to do with romance or obligation or anything the gossip sites will try to make it into tomorrow." The key gleamed in his palm, ordinary and mysterious all at once, and Sandra realized everyone near them had gone quiet, sensing something profound was happening even if they couldn't hear the words. "What is that?" she whispered, her throat tight with confusion and something else, something that felt like hope but sharper, more fragile. Keanu smiled then, sad and beautiful and utterly genuine, and said words that would echo in her mind for years to come, words that made tears spring immediately to her eyes, though she still didn't fully understand. "It's the key to the house next to mine," he said, "because I can't watch you carry everything alone anymore, and I'm proposing something no one expects. I'm proposing we build the family we both lost, the one we've been too scared or too proud or too damaged to believe we deserved." The garden seemed to hold its breath, the music still playing but distant now, like hearing your favorite song through water, and Sandra stood at the edge of a choice she'd never imagined having to make. Her entire carefully constructed life suddenly balanced on the edge of this impossible, terrifying, beautiful offer. And she had absolutely no idea what to say. You know those moments when you're just minding your own business at a wedding, and then something happens that completely changes how you see everything. That's exactly what happened to everyone in that garden on a perfect June afternoon. Sandra Bullock stood at the edge of the reception, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, watching her best friend Emily dance with her new husband. The string lights overhead swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting golden patterns across the faces of people lost in celebration. Sandra smiled, but anyone who really knew her could see the heaviness behind it. She'd been America's sweetheart for decades, beloved by millions, yet standing there surrounded by love and laughter, she felt profoundly alone in a way that success and fame could never quite fill. The wedding was everything Emily had dreamed of. Roses climbed the stone walls of the old estate, their scent mixing with jasmine and the faint sweetness of the wedding cake waiting to be cut. Children ran between tables, their laughter piercing through the classical quartet playing in the corner. Elderly relatives dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, overcome by the beauty of young love making promises under an endless sky. It was perfect, achingly perfect, and Sandra felt like she was watching it all from behind glass, close enough to see every detail but somehow separate from the warmth of it. She'd flown in from Atlanta where she was filming, exhausted from 18-hour days, but she wouldn't have missed this for anything. Emily had been there through everything. The divorces that tabloids feasted on, turning her private pain into entertainment consumed over breakfast tables across America. The adoption journeys that tested every ounce of her strength, the bureaucracy and the waiting and the fear that maybe she wasn't meant to be anyone's mother after all. The nights when being Sandra Bullock felt like wearing armor that was slowly crushing her from the inside out. When the weight of expectations and images and carefully maintained public personas made her forget who she actually was underneath it all. And Emily never asked for anything except her presence, her real self, the woman behind all the noise. Emily had known her since before the fame, back when Sandra was just another struggling actress waiting tables and going to auditions that led nowhere. Emily had been there for the first big break, screaming with joy in a tiny apartment that smelled like cheap wine and takeout. She'd been there for the Oscar win, and she'd also been there at 3 in the morning when Sandra called sobbing, because another relationship had crumbled under the pressure of cameras and speculation, and the impossibility of being both human and icon. Sandra took a small sip of the champagne, barely wetting her lips. She'd learned to hold drinks at events without actually drinking them, another skill acquired over years of navigating social situations where every gesture was photographed and analyzed. A photographer from the wedding moved through the crowd, capturing candid moments, and Sandra automatically angled herself slightly away, a practiced movement so ingrained she didn't even think about it anymore. Across the garden, she could see Emily's mother talking with a group of aunts, their hands moving expressively as they told stories Sandra couldn't hear but could imagine. Family stories, probably. The kind passed down through generations, polished smooth by repeated telling. Stories about grandparents who'd immigrated with nothing, about cousins who'd made good, about family recipes and old feuds and marriages that had lasted 50 years. The kind of stories Sandra's children would never hear about their biological families. The kind of history that couldn't be recovered or reconstructed, just accepted as lost. She pushed that thought away. Her kids were everything to her, more than any role or award or achievement. They'd saved her in ways she was still discovering, giving her a purpose that went beyond call sheets and box office numbers. But standing here watching Emily surrounded by generations of love and connection, Sandra felt the absence of something she couldn't quite name. Not romance, exactly. She'd tried that enough times to know it wasn't the answer. Something else. Something about belonging. Keanu Reeves arrived late, slipping through the garden gate with that characteristic quietness he carried everywhere, like someone who'd learned long ago that the world was loud enough without him adding to it. He was dressed simply in a dark suit that looked expensive in its understatement, his hair slightly longer than Hollywood usually preferred, going gray in a way that somehow made him look more himself rather than older. He moved through the crowd like water, acknowledging greetings with small nods and genuine smiles, but not stopping, not getting pulled into the social performance that events like this usually demanded. He spotted Sandra immediately, the way old friends do in crowded rooms, drawn by something deeper than sight. Their eyes met across the garden, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. She saw him excuse himself from a conversation he'd barely entered and begin making his way toward her, and she felt relief flood through her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. They'd starred in 2 films together, separated by decades. Speed, when they were both young and hungry and the world felt full of possibility. And then The Lake House, years later, both of them carrying weight they hadn't had before, speaking their lines to each other across time in that strange film, never sharing the screen directly but somehow more connected than in many scenes where actors stood face to face. Between and after those films, they'd maintained a friendship that the media loved to speculate about, always looking for romance where there was something both simpler and more complicated. Their connection was built on shared understanding, on knowing what it meant to carry grief that the public couldn't see. Keanu had lost people, loved ones torn away by tragedy and illness, losses that would have justified him becoming bitter or withdrawn. Instead, he'd somehow remained open, kind in a way that seemed almost defiant in its consistency. Sandra had watched him navigate his pain with a quiet grace that made her own struggles feel less isolating. They never talked about it directly, not really, but it was there in the way they checked in on each other, in the texts sent on difficult anniversaries, in the understanding that some wounds never fully heal but you learn to carry them anyway. He walked over and stood beside her without saying anything at first, just existing in the same space, and Sandra felt her shoulders drop an inch, releasing tension she didn't know she was holding. They watched the dancers together, 2 people who'd survived Hollywood's machinery with their humanity somehow intact, though not without scars. The music shifted to something slower, and more couples moved onto the makeshift dance floor, holding each other close, swaying in that timeless way that transcended the specific song or moment. "Beautiful wedding," Keanu said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Sandra nodded. "Emily deserves it. She deserves all of this." She gestured vaguely at the scene before them, the celebration and joy and promise. "She's one of the good ones." Keanu was quiet for a moment, then said, "So are you, Sandra?" She laughed, but it came out harder than she intended. "Am I? Some days I'm not so sure. Some days I feel like I'm just playing the role of Sandra Bullock, and I've been doing it so long I've forgotten where the performance ends." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she felt suddenly exposed in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or public scrutiny. "You're exhausted," he said, and it wasn't a question. Sandra closed her eyes briefly. "I'm always exhausted, Keanu. That's just what this life is. You know that as well as I do." When she opened her eyes again, he was still watching her with that steady, patient attention that he gave to everything, whether it was a conversation or a motorcycle engine or a piece of art. Like whatever was in front of him deserved his full presence. "It doesn't have to be," he said softly. Sandra felt something twist in her chest, something between hope and pain. "Doesn't it? We chose this. We chose the work, the visibility, the trade-offs. You don't get to complain about the weight of the crown when you fought to wear it." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and hated it, hated that this was what success had done to her, turned joy into burden and achievement into armor. Keanu shook his head slowly. "That's not what I mean. I'm not talking about the career or the fame or any of that. I'm talking about the other weight, the one you don't have to carry alone." Sandra looked at him, confused, and saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. He looked nervous, which was strange because Keanu never looked nervous. He'd faced down action sequences that could kill him, delivered Shakespearean monologues to thousands, navigated personal tragedies that would shatter most people, all with a calm that seemed almost supernatural. But right now, standing next to her at their friend's wedding, he looked genuinely afraid. "What are you talking about?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The celebration continued around them, oblivious to the shift happening in this small pocket of space. A burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table where Emily's college friends were telling stories. The quartet transitioned into another classical piece. The photographer captured a kiss between the newlyweds. Life went on, ordinary and extraordinary, while Sandra waited for Keanu to answer a question she didn't fully understand. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Sandra noticed his hand was shaking slightly. Keanu, who did his own stunts and rode motorcycles at speeds that terrified his insurance company and performed in front of millions, was shaking. "I've been thinking about this for months," he said. "Actually, if I'm honest, I've been thinking about it for years. But I didn't know how to say it or if I even should, because what if I'm wrong? What if this ruins everything?" "What are you talking about?" Sandra repeated, more urgently now because whatever this was, it felt important in a way that made her simultaneously want to know and want to run before she found out. Keanu pulled out a small velvet box, and Sandra's mind went completely blank, her thoughts scattering like birds startled into flight. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers, caught by Keanu's other hand in a reflex honed by years of fight choreography, before it could shatter on the stone patio. He set the glass on a nearby table, never breaking eye contact with her, and Sandra couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because this couldn't be what it looked like. They'd never been that kind of friends. The media had shipped them for decades, written fictional romances about their chemistry, speculated endlessly about secret relationships and missed opportunities. But it had never been that between them, had it? She'd never let herself think about it that way, had she? And now here he was with a ring box, and her entire understanding of their friendship was tilting on its axis. "Keanu, I don't," she started, but he shook his head, stopping her. "Let me say this, please. I've rehearsed it 1,000 times, and if I don't say it now, I might never have the courage again." He opened the box, and Sandra's confusion deepened because inside wasn't a diamond ring or any kind of traditional jewelry. It was a simple silver key, old-fashioned and slightly tarnished, the kind that might open a door in a house built generations ago. People near them had started to notice something was happening. Conversations trailed off. Eyes turned toward them. Someone whispered something to someone else. The photographer, sensing a moment, began to drift closer. Sandra was aware of all of it peripherally, but her focus had narrowed to Keanu's face, to the vulnerability written across features usually so carefully composed, to the key gleaming in the velvet box like a question waiting to be answered. "What is that?" she whispered, her throat tight with confusion and something else, something that felt like hope but sharper, more fragile, more terrifying. Keanu took a breath, steadying himself the way he might before a difficult scene, finding his center, and when he spoke his voice carried clearly despite its softness, carrying to the people now openly watching them. "Sandra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really hear me, not as an actress or a celebrity or any of the things the world needs you to be. Just as Sandra, just as my friend." The garden had gone quiet now, even the quartet seeming to sense something was happening, their music fading into silence. Emily had stopped dancing and was staring at them, her hand over her mouth. The moment stretched, crystalline and fragile, balanced on the edge of whatever came next. "It's the key to the house next to mine," Keanu said, and his voice cracked just slightly, showing the emotion he usually kept so carefully controlled. "I bought it 6 months ago. It's been empty since then because I was waiting, trying to figure out how to ask you this, how to offer you something without it sounding crazy or inappropriate or like I'm trying to change what we are." Sandra's mind was racing, trying to understand, trying to piece together what he was saying into something that made sense. "You bought a house," she managed. "Next to yours?" He nodded, and a small, nervous smile crossed his face. "In the hills, private, no cameras. There's a garden where your kids could play. A fence between the properties, but also a gate so we could be separate or together, whatever felt right." Tears were forming in Sandra's eyes now, hot and unexpected, because she still didn't fully understand, but she was beginning to, the shape of what he was offering starting to emerge like a photograph developing. "Keanu, why?" she asked, and her voice broke on his name. He stepped closer, still holding the box with the key, and she could see that his eyes were bright with unshed tears too. "Because I can't watch you carry everything alone anymore," he said, and the words came faster now, like a dam breaking. "Because we've both spent years believing we didn't deserve softness or support or family that wasn't biological or romantic. Because I see you at events like this, surrounded by people and completely isolated, and it breaks my heart because I know exactly how that feels. Because your kids should grow up knowing Uncle Keanu isn't just a title, it's a promise. Because we're both so tired, Sandra, and maybe we don't have to be." The tears were falling now, and Sandra didn't bother trying to stop them. Around them, she was vaguely aware of other people crying too, strangers moved by something they couldn't fully hear but could feel the weight of. Emily was openly sobbing, her new husband's arm around her shoulders. The photographer had lowered her camera, watching with naked emotion rather than professional distance. "What are you proposing?" Sandra asked, though she thought she was beginning to understand the impossible, beautiful, terrifying thing he was offering her. Keanu smiled then, sad and hopeful and utterly genuine, and said words that would echo in her mind for years to come, words that made her heart feel like it was cracking open and healing simultaneously. "I'm proposing we build the family we both lost, the one we've been too scared or too proud or too damaged to believe we deserved. Not romance, not marriage, not any conventional thing that people will try to make it into. But family, real family. The kind where I can call you at 2 in the morning when the grief is too heavy, and you can show up at my door when you need someone to just sit with you in silence. Where your kids have a place they can run to when they need space, and I have people who need me for something more than the next film or appearance. Where we stop pretending we have to do this alone." The garden seemed to hold its breath, the world paused between heartbeats, and Sandra stood at the edge of a choice she'd never imagined having to make. Every instinct she'd developed over decades in Hollywood told her this was crazy, that vulnerability like this led to pain, that letting someone this close was asking to be hurt. But underneath those instincts was something older and truer, a longing she'd tried to ignore for so long that acknowledging it now felt like remembering how to breathe after holding her breath for years. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, and it was the most honest thing she'd said in months, maybe years. Keanu held out the key, his hand steady now, decided. "You don't have to say anything yet. Take it. Think about it. Come see the house. But know that whatever you decide, I mean this. I'm here. Not as someone trying to fix you or save you or turn you into something for my own needs, but as family if you'll let me be." And Sandra Bullock, who'd spent her entire adult life knowing exactly what to say, who delivered thousands of lines with perfect timing and emotion, who'd accepted awards and given speeches and navigated interviews with practiced grace, found herself absolutely speechless, her carefully constructed life suddenly balanced on the edge of this impossible offer. Everything she thought she knew about friendship and family, and what she deserved crumbling and reforming into something entirely new. She reached out with a shaking hand and took the key.